All right, so today I'm going to talk about collective impact, and I'm really going to focus on building foundations, which is the first 18 months or so of a collective impact initiative. I find that when I talk to people about collective impact, a lot of people have now heard things like the 5 conditions of collective impact, or they've got a sense of what it is, but people are struggling to know, how do I do it? How do I actually get this thing off the ground? So what I'd like to do today is to take you on a bit of a graphic journey to show you what building collective impact in the first 18 months looks like, with a landing sometime around the end of that on a common agenda, shared agenda, community aspiration. Which brings me to another point, which is that there's a lot of language in collective impact. So to focus in, and you know which language I'm referring to, I'm basing the language I'm using today on a piece of work by Kabaj and Weaver at the end of 2017, and it's called Collective Impact 3.0. So the language that I'm using is a community aspiration instead of a common agenda, strategic learning instead of shared measurement, inclusive community engagement instead of continuous communication. But I still am using the language of backbone rather than a container for change, because I find that in the work that I do around Australia, the container for change language doesn't resonate as much as a backbone. So I will be sticking to that language today. Now, when we all first step into this work, and when we're looking at building the foundations, we've already got enough readiness to do something with it. So I'm not going to talk about what it's like to build the readiness to get started. I'm really going to focus on the doing of the work once you get started. Now, where this often starts is it often starts and you'll have, say, 3 or 5 people who are from across the different sectors, and they often have a shared interest or a shared worry that they're coming together and they want to do something about it. They don't know what to do, but they're coming together to do something about it. If you want to do this work so that in the end you've not come up with a management and governance structure that's holding a project, but you're coming up with a movement for change, the sooner that these 3 people go out and start chatting to other people, the better. And so at the beginning, these people tend to talk to people that they know, and we will have conversations going on about what's happening and ideas that people are sharing. Every time somebody goes, so this is inside the holding. So if we think about that in terms of our language, this is sort of inside the holding area, which, you know, can also be called the backbone work. And this is outside that area, but all of it together is the initiative. So people often think it's only the work that happens inside the holding, it's only the work that happens within the governance structures, etc., that are the work. But where I find this has worked the most is when people consider that any of the conversations that happen around the work are all inclusive and it's all a part of the initiative. So when these people, or when anybody that's becoming a part of the work goes out and chats to people, there's 3 phases of that I find work. One is that there needs to be something that you're giving, a piece of information, a piece of data, the worry that you're feeling, something, but there needs to be something that you are sharing and bringing to the conversation. There needs to be something that you are asking. We've noticed that the young people in this community are not staying at school to finish year 12, and we're worried about that. What are you noticing? And then the third part of this, right from the beginning, is the call to action. What we often do is we often ask for a lot of information, then we squirrel it away for a rainy day, for us to think, well, once we get everything sorted and it's looking really pretty, then we'll pull that together into some sort of activity. Whereas where I have found it's worked the most is when I've asked people, well, what can you do about that? What can you do today? You don't need any authority from anyone. You don't need any more resources. You can just step in and do it today. Because what you're trying to do, because you're building a movement, you're not building a governance structure, or you're not delivering on a project, you don't want to take away people's authority to act. And so anytime you go out, if you do keep that in mind, that I'm giving something, I'm asking something, but you are keeping the authority to act. I'm not taking that away from you at any stage. If we don't disempower, we don't have to then empower. So what happens with these loops is you find that you start seeing more people in the work. And the conversations, both within the environment and outside of the holding environment, get bigger. So what we're also trying to do is we're trying to think, well, what's the work that sits in here? It's not only about chatting to people, but what's the work that we need to do together? And some of the work that we need to do together is to look at and think about how we use data, because we want to be able to use data to help us understand and unpack an issue, as well as to help work out what is the activities we need to do. So at this end of the work, you're very much using data to help understand. And you're also trying to build a narrative. And in that, what you're trying to do is you're trying to understand, what is the narrative of me? So why am I, or why are all of us individually in this work? What's the narrative of us? So why are we coming together to do this work? And what's the narrative of now? So why are we doing this now? So the data is really important to help do that at this early phase, but so are these conversations, so that you start really building some narrative around the work. What also happens in terms of some of the information that you're gathering at this stage under the strategic learning is you're often doing things to try and understand the system. So you might be doing things like systems mapping, asset mapping. You might be doing things like resource mapping. You might be doing things like relationship mapping, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to build up as much information as you can to help inform and understand the issue that you're doing. Because as we know with collective impact, it's only worth stepping into it if the issue is complex enough for us to bother about. If you can solve an issue without going through all of this journey, do it. You don't need it. What then happens is when we get to about this part of the work, what the backbone group often do is we start to set up things like working groups. And the working groups very much sit inside this work. And a lot of the working groups at this early stage are focused on things like data story. How do I build the data story? Or how are we going to have community conversations? How are we getting the community voice in here? Or there might be a working group on how are we going to make decisions in a different way. So the working groups are very much around gathering information at this stage of the work. And so by the time you get a sizable lot of people in this work, you're often starting to define things like, a leadership table of some sort. And you've got working groups that you've gotten off the ground, and you might have other groups that are informing the work. So for example, in Go Goldfields, which was a work that I was a part of in Central Victoria, we had a family violence reference group that was only made up of women with lived experience of family violence as a way of getting their voice into the work. So really some of that depends on what is sitting in your community and how you can get the voices into the work that you're doing. So what's then happening out here is often what happens is people do a large community convening early on in the piece. So they'll do it back here somewhere, Whereas you've got to make sure that you've got enough commitment inside the work and enough conversations that have been going on outside the work so that when you do a large convening, people are turning up to show up. They're turning up to work on the things that you need them to work on. The other thing too is often when I do this, people think that I mean these are the community folk and these are the services. Well, it's not like that at all. Sometimes these initiatives start from community, so these may be predominantly community to start off with. Sometimes it starts from government, sometimes it starts from the service sector. These people out here can be people from business, from research, the service system, community leaders, anyone who you think you need to talk to and have involved in the conversation to help understand the issue that you're working on. So then what happens is we get to a point where we want to try something. And so we will do something, and it's really good to pick something that you don't need additional resources to do. You just want to give it a crack, and you don't have to, you think it's going to have an impact, but it doesn't have to change the world. And sometimes because you've been having conversations with people where you haven't taken the authority away from them, sometimes people come up with their own stuff and they'll say, I want to run this play group in this community because this community hasn't got a bush play group, and I think a bush play group is the thing that's going to help the issue that we're working on. So the role of the backbone team and the role of the collective at this stage is just not to get in the way. Firstly, because often we try and control it. We try to go, actually, that's not quite where we're up to yet. We're not really up to implementing anything yet, and it's really a good thing if you just don't dive in because we're trying to work out to do things differently. Sometimes it's a program. So a government department might say, oh, I've got funding for a supported playgroup program and I'm going to put it in here because that's the thing that I can do. Where it's worked really well is when backbones and people inside this work happen to go, great. Maybe the difference that we'll do when we do it this time is we will measure. So you do what you want to do. Let's see if we can test something and if we can learn from it. So at this stage of the work, it's often when we get into something like monitoring. And it actually doesn't matter whether the monitoring is traditional monitoring or whether you're trying to do a reflective learning cycle, etc. at this point. What I find is what is important is that people will measure something together to get something done and to reflect on it in some way. So that's the important thing that happens at that point. So as these things go along, what tends to happen is enough information is come in from all of these conversations to get a sense of what it is that are the things that we need to work on. And so it's often from this point that action groups get started. And the action groups are often focused around the particular area that you're placing your bets on, that you really think, actually, if we want to have a change in outcome, we want to have that more people are finishing year 12, one of the areas that we need to have an action group on is young people connected to social outings, whatever. So, and really that's been informed by all of this conversation that you've been having. So, when you're going along doing this work, a lot of people say that the currency is trust, that really you can't do anything without trust. But what happens in the real world, I think, is that often up this end, there's still a really strong focus on turf. At this end, people are still looking after their organisational boundaries. They're still looking after their own personal agenda. They're still holding on to the way that they've done things before and the things that have reinforced them as successful work before. Whereas what happens throughout this is you start building relationships. So with the relationships, you build trust. so that as you go through the process, with all of the conversations that you're having, people start to move from being in it for themselves to being in it for us, to being in it for the issue, to having trust to do something quite different together. As you go through this process, at some point you land on what Kabaj and Weaver call a community aspiration, but a lot of people call it a shared or common agenda. So I'll give you an example of this. Again, pulling on the Go Goldfields work, we had a whole lot of conversation that was happening around family violence. And about here in the process, we had a statement around family violence being a gendered issue, that it was about women and children living in an environment free from violence. It resonated really well in here. It did not resonate really well out here. So we had a large convening of the people who we had involved in a whole lot of conversations. And that convening stretched over a 6-week period. So sometimes we would have 70 people in the room, sometimes we would have 200 people in the room, but it was a rolling convening that lasted over a 6-week period. And at one stage, a local baker stood up in the room and he said to me, "Sharon, that statement's BS." But he didn't use the initials. Family violence is unacceptable in this community, and the noise that erupted in the room, I had so much trouble, getting the room back together again, because it was what became the community aspiration, and it's the thing that drives people's hearts, their heads and their feet. When you're coming up, as we had, which was a statement that we had called our shared agenda statement, it had excellent head stuff in it because we had grounded it in data and done all of those sorts of things, but it actually had no heart in it. And because it had no heart, it had no feet either. It only had what we were willing to do ourselves. So this process here takes you about a good 18 months, I would suggest, sometimes longer, because you don't always have a smooth path here. Sometimes you go around these loops quite a bit, and sometimes you can sort of get up here a tad, and then a couple of key people leave the area, and all of a sudden you're back here somewhere. So it's not a linear thing. It doesn't always play out as beautifully as the drawing. So people have said to me, "But what's the jobs you need to do?" And the jobs really fall into 4 different headings. There's the structures that you need to set up. There's the processes that you need to put in place. There's the mindsets that you need to build. And there's the equity or the power that you need to finish. So I have been talking a lot about the work. So inside the work, outside the work, doing the work. So what we're going to talk about now is, so what is the work that we're all doing together? And for me, it really resonates. There's some work by a man called Bob Flood that Megan Sagan put me onto earlier this year that I find really resonates for how to think about the work that you need to be doing in the first 18 months of collective impact. And it breaks down very much into structures, processes, mindsets or how we're thinking about things, and equity or how we're using power. So the sorts of structures that often get set up in this first 18 months is the leadership. And with that, it's around how you're going to hold the work. As I said before, you'll set up working groups. There might be action groups. There might be reference groups. However you set up your structures to help hold what you're doing and how you're doing the work together. The other thing that happens in terms of structures around here too is to look at the backbone. So how are you building a backbone team? Have you got a part-time person doing 3 days a week, which will really restrict what you're able to do potentially in the first 18 months? Or have you got services or people kicking in some energy or some people to actually be on the ground to help do that work? And so it's looking at the number that you need and the role that you need them to have. And then the other structures that you're setting up is you're setting up things like accountabilities. So the way that I often think about it is it's sort of two flows that you set up in the structures. One is the functional flow, which is really holding the collective impact journey that you're on. And then the other is like the housekeeping. So who's employing the staff, who's holding the dollars, if the dollars come through a government grant, who's doing the acquittals, etc. So they don't have to be held by the one organisation. And I think it often helps if the organisation that is holding the housekeeping is not a service delivery organisation, but an organisation whose role it is to hold the whole of community for something, or whose role it is to deliver on collaboration or deliver on a partnership brokering role, etc. So in terms of the processes, the processes that are often being worked on in this stage are community engagement. Although more often than not, the way that I'm framing that up is community conversations. Just around when we talk about it as community engagement, it often plays into processes that people are already doing that are more about consulting people. So I will go out and I've done 90% of the thinking before I come out and talk to you about it. And then when I come to you about it, what I want you to do is to just give me a few extra ideas or to validate my thinking. Whereas when we've gone out really early and we haven't done any thinking and we're taking out what we have and we're asking and we're doing the call to action, it's more a conversation than engaging the community. And it puts the community in the same framework that you have with other people. You have conversations with funders, you have conversations with research organisations, you have conversations with other services. And so it's really building a shared platform for how you work with everybody, no matter where they are in the ecosystem that you're trying to work on. The other piece of work that's going on in this bit is you're doing data gathering. So the process here around data is understanding the issue. The next thing that you're also doing in terms of the process is you're looking at building up the narrative. So you're looking at collecting stories. And the processes that you use to collect those stories can be as simple as there's a technique called most significant change. And that has a methodology for collecting stories. And you don't have to use the whole most significant change reflection piece if you don't want to. It's just a really good structure for collecting stories. So what you're also defining in the process are things like how we're going to communicate across our structures. And you're looking at things like how we're going to define the system. So the processes that you might be looking at are systems mapping. You might be doing relationship mapping. You might be doing resource mapping. Some of the tools that you see in management textbooks, etc., you can use here. The main difference is that all of the processes that you undertake when you're doing it in collective impact, you do it with other people. So the backbone, it works best if the backbone doesn't go away and do the systems mapping, or the backbone doesn't go away and do the relationship mapping, but that these are seen as dynamic processes and that you do them over time with many, many people. What happens with that is you not only get a richer sense of information for the system that you're operating in, but it co-opts people. People get interested in what you're doing and why you're doing it. This area here, which is about mindset, the work that you're doing is you're working to try to understand each other. So you're trying to work out where everybody's coming from. So the work that you're doing is you're working on putting processes in place in your communication to hear diversity. So how do you hear difference of opinion, and how do you listen to those differences of opinion rather than go in and going, Jennifer's always like that, Jennifer always says that, but to go in and with open ears listen to the different opinions that somebody has. The other part of understanding each other is to understand ourselves as well, and the biases that everybody, including ourselves, bring to the work. And to help do that sort of work, often people say, but what does that even mean? Often it's even just having conversations around these tables about it. So there are some great little YouTube clips that you can access. If you just Google exercises to unpack biases, you come up with a good half a dozen little YouTube clip exercises that you can go through. If the more that you can have the conversations at your tables about what is diversity, what does it mean to us, how are we going to listen to it, people are clever. They come up with lots and lots of ideas. What often happens and that gets in the way is people don't want to talk about it, or they've never talked about it in meetings before. They're used to coming to these meetings and talking about action and activity, and you're inviting them to these meetings to talk about how they're thinking and how people across the system are thinking, and how that thinking either gets in the way of you understanding the issues that you're trying to work with, or can help you understand the issues that you're trying to work with. The other thing that happens, a big piece that plays out in the mindset things, is getting a sense about what systems What are systems? What is systems thinking? What is working in a systemic way mean? We are taught in everything that we do to think programmatically. And we've been working for years around a theory of change that says if we put the right program in at the right time, we will change the outcomes for the community. And so a lot of work at this time is really unpacking how programs are great and they're really good for individual people or even individual subsets of populations that are experiencing that program, but it doesn't change the basic outcome for the community, whereas the systems piece has the potential to change the overall outcome for the community. And there's a lot of conversation, a lot of building understanding, a lot of learning, a lot of building capacity around this dynamic that happens in the first 18 months of this work. And then the fourth quadrant, which is around equity, is getting really clear about who makes the decisions, where the decisions are made, and what decisions who makes. So often in a traditional way of doing this work, you'd have a leadership table or a governance table, and it would be there that the decisions are made. And they're holding the yay or nay across the whole work. Where this works really beautifully is when that leadership table's role is holding the way we do the work together, and that the decision for actions and what acts sits with the action groups. And the decisions around how we're going to hold the data, etc., sits with the working groups. The more that you can push the decision making closer to the community whose lives you're affecting, the stronger the decisions are that are made. And so it's very critical around who you get around this table so that you can make the decisions at the right place to have the impact that you want to have. And the other thing that plays out a lot in the equity thing that I notice is both the formal versus social power play out. And you see this a lot. So people often come to this work and they see these are the structures we have to do, these are the processes we have to do, and they come in their job. I'm here and I'm doing this job and I am the CEO of this particular organisation, so therefore I should be the boss of this, etc. And often we don't pay enough attention to the social power that people bring. So an example of this was in one community I worked in, there was a woman with deep lived experience of family violence, and she knew everyone in that community that had a child under the age of 5. And although she had 5 children to 4 different fathers, she had been living in public housing all of her adult life. She struggles financially, etc. But in terms of her social capital and her social power, if there was anything that we needed to get out or back into the work, she was incredible. So a part of the work in the first 18 months is to really get as explicit as possible about this. And the way that I've found works is the more that you can have this as a part of the agenda, a part of the work that you're doing together, so that you talk openly and honestly about what's the power you're bringing to this piece of work that you're doing together. What can you bring and how are you going to use it? And the other thing that happens around the first 18 months too is constantly looking at how you're using the power for your purpose. So there's a whole lot of the more conversations that you have about the purpose of our work and that we're delivering on a purpose and that we're delivering on outcomes, helps move the conversation from I'm delivering on the strategic plan of my organisation or on the annual report that I've just delivered to a board. So mostly people think that for this work to work, it's getting this right and this right. But the reality is that this is really the 2 areas where the work sings or not. The more that there is a challenging and a thinking consciously about how we do the work differently together, and the more that you understand and unpack the power that is in the work, the more that you can move what you're doing together to change the outcomes of the work that you're working on. So even though in here is nothing like a playgroup or running a story time, there's much work in here to do in order to be building the environment that you need to have so that a collective impact can work. For those activities, they can sit anywhere in here. So people look at this and they say, well, there's nothing solid in this, like, running a play group or running an activity. But there can be. If anybody comes up with any of those ideas, there's nothing wrong with fitting it into the work that you're doing. And it gives you an opportunity to use that activity to ask questions about how you're thinking about the work together, or to look at who's making the decisions and how you're using the power together. Everything's an opportunity.